In Colombia, one of the world's most powerful and violent drug traffickers has spent his first full day in jail, and a very comfortable jail. It might be good for Colombia, but many U.S. officials are not pleased. Here's ABC's Mark Potter.
After months of negotiations, Pablo Escobar was flown by government helicopter to a comfortable jail in his hometown, where some American authorities worry he could still run his business. Current and former U.S. law enforcement officials fear the Colombian government has given in to the traffickers.
In the 1980s, one man transformed the city of Medellin, Colombia, into the global epicenter of cocaine trafficking. His name, Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria. Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria was born on December 1, 1949, in Rio Negro, Colombia, and grew up in Medellin. His father, Abel de Jesus Dari Escobar Echeverri, was a farmer, while his mother, Hermilda de los Dolores Gaviria Berrio, was a teacher. Pablo was the third of 7 children. Pablo Escobar grew up in a violent environment in Colombia in the late 1940s. At that time, Colombia was embroiled in a civil war between the Conservative Party in power and the Liberals, who were determined to overthrow the government. Additionally, there were groups of men who didn't align with either side. They were simply criminals or delinquents, often from rural areas, taking advantage of the country's turmoil to terrorize Colombia's wealthy and pillage businesses. As a young boy, Escobar witnessed extreme violence. At the age of 12, he moved with his mother to Envigado, south of Medellin. There, he encountered youths inspired by the recent Cuban Revolution, particularly by its leader, Fidel Castro. Escobar deeply identified with this figure. Growing up in Medellin, one of Colombia's largest cities and notorious as a hub of crime, Escobar began associating with troublemakers who promised him wealth and power in exchange for breaking the law. He wasn't particularly bright in school, but had an entrepreneurial spirit from a young age. He reportedly started his criminal career by selling tombstones, from which he erased inscriptions to resell them. He then moved on to car theft and various scams, eventually committing his first kidnapping, which quickly got him noticed and earned him a name in the crime world. Colombia in the late 1960s was far from being a paradise on earth. Among the many criminals, one stood out, Alfredo Gomez Lopez, who made a fortune through cigarette smuggling. In 1970, he recruited new bodyguards, including a 21-year-old Pablo Escobar and his cousin Gustavo. Escobar had just set foot in the world of organized crime. He quickly became very skilled and deeply involved, which allowed him to accumulate a lot of money rapidly. He then decided to start his own business, cocaine trafficking, a drug extracted from the coca leaf that grows abundantly in Colombia. Escobar soon became one of the most feared criminals in Medellin. He began with small-scale operations, transporting cocaine from Colombia to the United States. Over time, he structured and expanded his operations, forming what would become the Medellin Cartel. Escobar managed his empire like a multinational corporation, controlling the production, transport, and distribution of cocaine. He used a combination of corruption and terror to secure his operations, bribing officials and police, and brutally eliminating his rivals. His distribution network extended across North America, Europe, and Asia, controlling over 80% of the global cocaine traffic. At its peak, Pablo Escobar's personal fortune was estimated at around $30 billion, making him one of the richest men in the world, according to Forbes.
I didn't saw anybody from Forbes in our family looking into our wallets. It's a way to sell a lot of magazines. He was a very rich man, and I asked him, how much money do you have? And he told me, I don't know. I really don't want to count that.
His cartel brought in about $70 million a day by the late 1980s. This wealth allowed him to fund social projects in the poor neighborhoods of Medellin, enhancing his image among the population, where he was even considered a Robin Hood. When Pablo was 23 years old, he met a very young girl, Maria Victoria Henao, who was only 12 at the time.
Escondidas.
Ay, sí, yo, ese susto que yo tenía, yo sentía que no iba a poder llegar a verlo.
Ya se dieron un beso, ellos se abrazaron y yo pues... Ahí fue el primer beso robado prácticamente.
¿Tenía cuántos años? 13 años. Tenía 23.
No le llevaba sino 10.
24.
3 years later, Maria and Pablo got married without the consent of her family. She was 15 and already pregnant by him. Together, they had 2 children, Juan Pablo, born in 1977, and Manuela, born in 1984. Pablo Escobar was willing to do anything to protect his family, his mother, his wife, despite cheating on her, and especially his children. Pablo Escobar lived a true family life, while his drug activities continued to grow. Let's go back to 1976. He decided to take things to the next level by partnering with other drug traffickers, including his friend Carlos Leda. Together, they created the infamous Medellin Cartel, as mentioned earlier.
At the top 3 men of the Medellin Cartel, all fugitives, hide out and operate. They are Carlos Leda, 37, described by federal authorities as a psychopathic killer who has aligned the cartel with Colombia's M19 terrorists. Pablo Escobar, 36, under indictment in Miami for his role in setting up cocaine bases in Nicaragua, described as Colombia's wealthiest man. Jorge Ochoa, 37, caught in Spain earlier this year, but freed and now in hiding in Colombia after allegedly bribing a Colombian magistrate to fix his case. Federal authorities say these 3 men now run an organization more violent and at least as powerful as...
Escobar and Leta established an extensive network for transporting and storing drugs in the Bahamas. To achieve this, they bought an island, Norman's Cay, where they built a hotel, airstrips, heliports, and most importantly, cocaine refueling areas. At the same time in Colombia, he developed his own cocaine production labs. The Medellin Cartel covered the entire Colombian territory. They hired hitmen, and any means were valid to smuggle cocaine, submarines, or people crossing the border with cocaine capsules in their stomachs. They swallowed plastic bags of cocaine and retrieved them at the end of the journey. The cartel also worked with police, judges, and even politicians. Escobar's men were protected by the Colombian government, which, for example, allowed all illegal flights of planes or helicopters belonging to the cartel. At 29 years old, Pablo Escobar, as the head of the cartel, was free to do whatever he wanted in Colombia. He told people, "I do what I want. You let me do it. I give you money. You accept or you die." People generally preferred to stay alive. His now famous motto was Plata o Plomo. In 1979, all members of the Medellin Cartel were billionaires. That year, Pablo Escobar, now called Don Pablo, built the Hacienda Napolis, 100 kilometers from Medellin. This 20-square-kilometer estate included 20 artificial lakes, 6 swimming pools, an airstrip, a zoo, and a go-kart track. At the entrance to his home, he installed a replica of the plane used for his first cocaine shipment to the United States as a trophy. Pablo organized massive parties at his house with the American and Colombian elite, fueled by cocaine and alcohol. At this time, the Medellin Cartel was at its peak, generating over $25 billion per year and controlling more than 80% of the global cocaine market. As I mentioned at the start of the video, besides these huge parties, Pablo publicly distributed part of his money to the poor. He built soccer clubs and several hundred houses. He even created a neighborhood called Barrio Pablo Escobar, which isn't officially on maps but does exist. It was built completely illegally, further solidifying Pablo Escobar's image as a modern-day Robin Hood. The rich saw him as a threat, while the poor saw him as a hero. However, on his property, the drug lord increasingly hosted underage girls. Despite being the king of cocaine, Pablo Escobar himself consumed very little. From video archives we found, you can even hear him saying it's kind of ridiculous to use it.
Il faut être réaliste. Nous sommes en train de vivre la civilisation de la cocaïne. La cocaïne est en train d'envahir le monde. Pourquoi est-elle en train de l'envahir? Parce qu'elle est une drogue moins forte, moins nuisible que d'autres. Le problème des drogués est un problème de manque d'éducation et de discipline. C'est pareil avec l'alcool. Il n'y a aucune différence entre un homme couché sur le trottoir parce qu'il est ivre et un drogué.
In 1982, he presented himself to the Colombian Congress. He was all-powerful in the criminal world. He started looking for ways to legitimize his industry while increasing his personal power. The 32-year-old criminal became a substitute congressman, allowing him to replace a member during their absence. Escobar considered this appointment a sign of affection from his people. He saw himself as a great man, and his money allowed him to fulfill his most extravagant desires, such as becoming the president of Colombia. However, Escobar soon discovered that his popularity did not extend to the country's capital, Bogotá. Presidential candidate Luis Gayland denounced Escobar's ties to the cocaine trade, and Justice Minister Rodrigo Lara Bonilla began to crack down on electoral contributions linked to drug trafficking. In January 1984, Escobar was expelled from Congress, ending his political career, but he had no intention of disappearing. 3 months later, he had Bonilla assassinated. 2 men, one armed with a submachine gun, arrived on motorcycles. The motorcycle approached Rodrigo Lara Bonilla's limousine, which was stopped at a traffic light. The man in the back pulled out his weapon, shattered the car window and blew Bonilla's head off. People realized that this man had just killed a cabinet member. The assassination of Bonilla was a significant step in Escobar's escalation of terrorism to force Colombia into submission. While Colombia fought the terrorism financed by drug traffickers, the United States began its own war on drugs.
The United States must work to defeat international drug trafficking.
Soon, Escobar would face a new threat, to which he would respond with a series of bombings. By the mid-1980s, Pablo Escobar's cocaine empire held the Colombian nation at its mercy. 4,000 kilometers to the north, the President of the United States had declared a war on drugs. The United States exerted increasing pressure on the Colombian police, military, government, and judiciary to end the drug trade. The Colombian government agreed to allow the United States to extradite traffickers who shipped drugs to America. Escobar knew that he would not be treated the same way in the United States. If he stood trial there, he would be convicted and rot in a real prison, which would be the end of their enterprise. He used to say, "I'd rather have a grave in Colombia than a cell in the United States." In November 1985, Escobar and other traffickers decided to unite their efforts and show the government that they would not be intimidated. Escobar called on a group of guerrillas to launch an assault on the Palace of Justice, which housed the Supreme Court of Colombia. The guerrillas, armed with machine guns, rockets and grenades, stormed the building and attacked the Supreme Court judges. The Colombian army responded with tanks and assault troops. During the siege, 97 people were killed, including 11 of the 24 Supreme Court judges. The assault on the Palace of Justice was another pivotal moment in Colombian history. It had a long-term impact as it terrorized the judicial system. The guerrillas destroyed all extradition documents. They managed to convince the Colombian population that these acts of terrorism were due to extradition. The following year, the Supreme Court of Colombia annulled the treaty authorizing extradition. But a few days later, the treaty was reinstated by the new president of Colombia, Virgilio Barco. Fearing deportation to the United States again, Pablo Escobar built hideouts all over Colombia. Pablo Escobar became the most wanted man in Colombia. For several years, he managed to evade law enforcement, aided by police officers who worked for him and many supporters, particularly in the lower classes whom he had helped a lot. Whenever a team was sent to find him, he was warned in advance. Escobar always seemed one step ahead of the police. Legend has it that every time the police arrived at a location to capture him, they would find a clean, empty house, with the bed still warm, almost like a taunt. However, one person did manage to find him, a French journalist named Tony Cognati, in 1988. The two men met in Escobar's private residence, and the footage was astonishing. By the time of this interview, Escobar had been on the run for 3 years. Despite his $30 billion fortune, which made him the 7th richest person in the world, he was starting to get tired. His greatest pleasure was spending time with his family, his mother, wife and children, but this was becoming increasingly difficult. His worst nightmare was being extradited to the United States, so he did everything in his power to pressure the Colombian government. One of the most notable incidents occurred on August 18, 1989. Luis Carlos Galán, the front-runner in the Colombian presidential election, was giving a much-anticipated speech in Soacha, a suburb of Bogotá. As Galán took the stage, he was assassinated in front of the crowd. It quickly became clear that Pablo Escobar was behind it all, and he lost the support of the people who had backed Galán. Many now saw Escobar as an enemy of the people. Escobar did not stop there. He decided to eliminate another presidential candidate, Cesar Gaviria, Galán's successor. He knew Gaviria was scheduled to fly on Avianca Flight 203 on November 27, 1989. Escobar had a bomb planted on the plane, and just 3 minutes after takeoff it exploded, killing 107 people. Gaviria, however, was not on the flight and was later elected president of Colombia. Throughout the country, especially in the Medellin region, Pablo Escobar ruled with terror. Alongside his high-profile actions, there were countless murders linked to the drug trade every day. The United States intervened, putting a bounty on the head of the world's most wanted drug trafficker, which motivated many people to join the search for him. The Colombian government even created a special unit, the Search Bloc, whose sole mission was to capture Escobar. American and Colombian military forces cooperated to try to catch him. As the search bloc began to kill more and more of Escobar's associates, he realized things were getting tough. In the summer of 1990, Escobar devised a plan. He kidnapped numerous children from Colombia's wealthiest families, essentially taking them hostage. He promised to release them if these families' members lobbied to have extradition treaties abolished. Escobar was desperate to avoid imprisonment in the United States, and his violent tactics pushed Colombia's most powerful figures to pressure the government, which eventually abolished the extradition treaties. In 1991, knowing he wouldn't be sent to an American prison, Pablo Escobar finally surrendered to Colombian authorities, confessing to some of his crimes, but certainly not all.
In Colombia, one of the world's most powerful and violent drug traffickers has spent his first full day in jail, and a very comfortable jail. It might be good for Colombia, but many U.S. officials are not pleased. Here's ABC's Mark Potter.
After months of negotiations, Pablo Escobar was flown by government helicopter to a comfortable jail in his hometown, where some American authorities worry he could still run his business. Current and former U.S. law enforcement officials fear the Colombian government has given in to the traffickers.
The Colombian government boasts of having captured the world's most wanted drug trafficker. He himself designed the plans for his prison because they were going to build a prison just for him. This prison, which he named La Catedral, even had guards he selected. It featured a soccer field, a nightclub, a bar and a jacuzzi. He could receive his family, friends and women. The police were not allowed to come within 20 kilometers of the prison. In short, this prison was a joke. His imprisonment was more symbolic. They knew where he was, and he wouldn't terrorize Colombia anymore.
It is discouraging because I really believed over the last 7-8 years that traffickers were really on the run, and I don't believe it was necessary to make a deal like this for him.
However, he continued to manage his trafficking networks from afar, and his men became increasingly violent. He even had some of his enemies brought to the prison, where he personally tortured them. La Catedral was the headquarters of crime and drug trafficking, and the government knew it. In 1992, President Gaviria, the same man Escobar had tried to assassinate, decided to transfer him to a real prison. Escobar heard about this and escaped. Now on the run, he was more alone than ever. His family was in hiding, and his associates were afraid of being caught if they were seen with him. In his last attempt to intimidate the Colombian government, on January 30th, 1993, Pablo Escobar planted a bomb in downtown Bogotá. The attack resulted in around 20 deaths and 70 injuries. The Colombian people, who had lived in terror of narco attacks for over a decade, had had enough. Escobar had killed thousands of people during his life, and after this attack on civilians, the people started to believe that if the police couldn't catch him, they would take matters into their own hands. This is how Los Pepes was born, an acronym for People Persecuted by Escobar. It was a militia composed of his enemies, including the Cali Cartel, rivals of the Medellin Cartel, and even former members of Escobar's own cartel who had switched sides. They were relentless, eliminating more and more of Escobar's close associates. Meanwhile, the American intelligence services and Colombian police launched Operation Heavy Shadow, making numerous arrests of Escobar's former associates. Over 20,000 raids were conducted. There were Israelis, Englishmen, Americans, Colombian intelligence, the CIA, the DEA, and the Search Bloc. They used the same tactics as Escobar, bombing buildings he owned and killing his horses and even members of his family. It was nearing the end, and Escobar could feel it. Pablo Escobar is cornered. He changes hideouts almost every day. The hunt becomes too intense, and the Search Bloc eventually catches up with some of his most important associates, progressively dismantling the Medellin Cartel. Pablo finds himself alone. As the weeks go by, he misses his family more and more. He calls them briefly from time to time, following the rules of being on the run, always staying on the move to avoid capture. Escobar knows he's being wiretapped. On December 1st, 1993, Pablo Escobar turns 44, hiding alone. The next day, December 2nd, he wants to talk to his family, but this time he takes fewer precautions and stays on the phone longer. The Secret Services manage to locate him. The military brings out heavy artillery, and the house is completely surrounded. Pablo Escobar is trapped. The soldiers enter the house with little difficulty, first killing Escobar's bodyguard. In the frenzy of the moment, Escobar makes a final move. He exits the house through a window, climbs onto the roof with a pistol in each hand, shooting wildly and shouting insults at the police. Then the inevitable happens. Pablo Escobar is shot 3 times, once in the leg, once in the stomach, and once in the ear. After 18 months of tracking, the greatest drug lord in history dies instantly, his head smashed against the roof tiles. In the aftermath, the proud soldiers take photos with his corpse. The day after his death, December 3rd, 1993, there is chaos in the streets of Medellin for Pablo Escobar's funeral. More than 10,000 people attend this historic event. While many rejoice at his death, others continue to celebrate him. Even today, Pablo Escobar remains a highly controversial figure, as fascinating as he is terrifying. One thing is certain, he leaves no one indifferent. The story of a small-time delinquent who became the world's greatest drug lord, rising to be the 7th richest man globally, with his legacy hidden somewhere in Colombia. Pablo Escobar was a man close to the people who built his own legend. It's a story full of ambivalence and hidden aspects. The story of Pablo Escobar is also that of cocaine, at the heart of relations between the two Americas, marked by extreme violence in the service of a completely insane business. This was the story of Pablo Escobar.